So the first thing I want to do today is we're going to talk about radio programming, obviously, and the focus will really be on all the core stuff you need to initially get a plane up, reasonably flying, just the basic stuff. We'll go over some other extra things afterwards, but I realized in prepping for this that we need to talk a little bit about the setting up of the model, some of the setup of the model. So I want to share with you something I want to show relative to that, because this has come up before in general with planes. So I have my make-believe servo here, and my servo has an arm on it that can move back and forth. And I have my make-believe wing with its aileron over here. And if I was to take it and put a control arm in there, and I did the control arm like this, and I'm gonna put my glasses on. So if I just set up my plane, I built a plane. Now, of course, if you bought the plane, this should all be set up already. But if I do this right here and just put it on the closest holes, if I move, the servo moves about 10 degrees, I get about 10, 20 gives me about 20, 30 and 30 and so on. And likewise the other way. And the goal should be on the servo side to use most of its range. So servos are typically plus and minus 60 degrees. So if off of center, they should go close to 60 each way. And some go more, some go less, but we'll just stick to the general idea. So in this case here, where I've linked it just the first hole to the first hole, when I get over to 50, that control surface, like here, my aileron's deflecting quite a bit. And for a lot of the planes we fly, that's probably too much. It's not enough for Al's 3D plane, but that's a different thing we're not talking about right now. We're just talking about a lot of the general aviation stuff we fly. And so I would be programming my radio maybe to stop right about there, and I'm only using 25 degrees of my servo. And we got someone else on. Okay. So if I moved it out like that to try and did that, well, that helps a little bit. Actually, let me do it the other way. So even worse. Hang on. Even worse, if I did this, and this is the important part, really. If I did this, where I moved 10 degrees of servo or 20 degrees of servo, now the wing, the surface is deflecting way too much. Okay, and I'm really limiting how much of the servo I use. So if I go by the rule where we want to be as close in on the servo as possible, but as far out as reasonable on the control surface, then I got a different linkage here I'm going to put on. So now, if I move 10 degrees, I get 5 degrees of deflection, 20, 30, 40. So here I am, I'm using the range of my servo to get a reasonable range of aileron movement. And of course, every surface and plane is going to differ. The reason for this and why we strive for this, we want to use as much of the range of the servo as we can and as is reasonable, because that makes our surface movement smoother. And we should be able to see that here now. A lot of movement on the servo is a little movement on the aileron or whatever surface, okay? Any questions on that? Any thoughts?
Excellent, Pro.
Yeah, kudos on the diagram.
I saw someone else online. I saw a video. Someone had made one like that. So I stole the idea from them, but I designed it myself. Now, you would never have a control surface, with a horn like that, but that exaggerates the idea. So, but the general rule, be as close in on the servo as possible and as far out as needed or reasonable on the control surface horn. The big advantage also is your servo is a lot stronger when it's linked closer in than when out. So Al's big 3D planes need very strong servos because he needs a lot of throw and he needs to connect it out farther out to get that throw. So his servos have to be very strong. And there'll be there's probably lots of times where we've been flying or see planes flying at the field and we don't know that the servo is struggling against the air on the control surface and it's actually not going as far. On my video hung up. It's not going as far as you're commanding it to. So, okay. How we doing? Good. So, you guys still hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, it glitched on my end a little bit. So anyway, so on the programming side, let's start off just talking about some hardware stuff real quick. And hopefully you guys are looking at my other video feed too. So on the hardware side, the old radios had one antenna like this, and you could flip it over and move it around. An antenna is strongest on its side and weakest when the tip is pointing at the aircraft. And of course, the issue on these was what position do you put it in that always keeps the plane off to the side. And so the modern radio, what people may not know is the modern radio, like these Spectrums.
Yeah, Chris, we're seeing a hardware dual antenna screen.
Oh, sorry. Well, if you look at my, sorry.
You have to look at his little thumbnail picture.
Yeah, if you go to speaker view instead of gallery view, then you'd see me. Or I'll tell you what, I'll flick the camera on. Hang on.
No, that's okay. Speaker view. Yep.
Yeah. So, or here. So, the old style was just this little rubber ducky that you had to flick around, you know. But the new ones, the key thing about a modern radio, if you're not running one, there's two antennas. There's an antenna like where it's always been, right here. But there's another antenna in the handle. And those two antennas are perpendicular to each other. So that's one advantage of a modern radio is you have that. That's enough of the show and tell for there. So also, just to be familiar with our radios, sticks are adjustable if you don't know it. So if you feel like your sticks are too long or they're too tight or the little ratcheting thing on the throttle is too ratchety, you can adjust that. Most radios on the backside have holes you can open up and you can go in there and adjust some screws and change that. Or you can unscrew the sticks and relock them so they can be longer or shorter. So if you don't know about that, that's something you may help you someday. Most radios, even my more modern DX9 has two jacks on the back. One's a headphone, one's a trainer jack. I've tried it before, plugging a headphone in so I can hear things better, and sometimes it helps, sometimes not. And the trainer jack is still there because it used to be you had to connect a wire between the person doing the training and the trainee. But modern radios now have wireless trainer mode. So you don't need that cable anymore. So like our trainer at the field can do that. And that's a different brand, but our trainer can do that. If you don't use it already, I recommend you use, most radios now have a place for an SD card to store the setups of your models that you're flying. So if you're not doing that, you should. It's also used for firmware upgrades and for getting models. If someone else has a model and they want to share with you, you can put it in your radio that way. Hang on a second, I'm going to mute them. I muted you, Steve. We could hear you.
Yeah.
So lastly, if this came up last week and I had to deal with it, so I'll show you later in the menu, but if you're changing your radio from like AA's to lithium ion, it's okay to just keep it charged up all the time. I plug my radio in every time I'm done with it, keep it fully charged. And on the Spectrums, when you got to tell the radio, hey, I'm using a lithium ion now, not AA's. It changes the voltage at which it warns you it's getting low. However, it sets it pretty low. You want to set it higher, and we'll take a look at that later when we get to that part in the looking at the radio stuff. So one other thing I'll show you right here real quick. Most radios have a similar menu like this, where they give you this basic information like the name of the model, so you know you're on the right one when you go to use your plane. DSMX, that's telling you what technology it's currently using to talk to the plane. And because spectrums can do two different kinds, the old one and the new one, X being the new one, it's showing you which one it's using. It's going to show you the battery voltage of the transmitter, your trims. So when you're trimming the plane, so making those fine adjustments, either first flight or for whatever reason, it's showing you where they currently are. The timer that you're running currently to count down. And then on mine, this is how long the model has ever been on. There's another timer that's just always counting. So I looked at one the other day and it had a lot of hours on it. Now that means if I spend an hour on the bench just doing some stuff, it's going to tick up an hour on it. Doesn't mean I'm actually flying time. Okay. So all radios should have some basic information that you'd want to be familiar with for your radio. So take the time to get familiar with it. One thing we'll see if you're using Spectrum, there's this little pickle that you want to be familiar with, that they show you the current position of switches. So that little black chunk is going to move when you flick a switch. So you know which one you're on, where you're open or closed. Okay. So most radios are going to give you lots of little feedback. So being familiar with it's very helpful. So on most radios, and especially Spectrum, there's two main areas of programming. There's the function list, which is the first one and is specific to that model that you're in. The deeper list is the system setup list, and that's the one that's relative to the model, but also relative to just general radio stuff and applies to all your models. So like what I said, the battery setup, for instance, what kind of batteries you're using, that's going to be across all models. But there's also some stuff in the system setup screen that's specific to that particular model plane that you brought up. So let me clarify that too, that we should all be familiar with. I would assume that in these modern radios, the term model is because a modern radio, I can fly all my planes with one radio by changing which model is currently active in the radio. Okay. So when we talk about model on the radio side, that's what we're talking about. How we doing, guys?
Good.
Still awake, right?
What's that?
Still awake.
Still awake. Yeah. Well, it's going to get interesting now. So, okay. So I thought about this, like, what's the minimum needed? Just if somebody said, okay, here's a plane at the field, get it flying, and just with the bare minimum, then what would I need? And so I would need to grab the radio, tell it I'm making a new model. This is important because, one, you want to keep a new model, obviously, if it's a new plane, but it means that all the settings in there, trims and adjustments and everything, are starting at their zero or neutral point. There's been a number of times where folks have had some trouble, and we find out and figure out that it came about because, well, I reused a model, but I didn't clear it out. And there's a function there to say, reset everything. So it's okay to reuse a model, but you got to make sure it's all neutraled out and there's nothing left over from the previous plane. So I would do a new model. Then, of course, I would bind it with the plane. I would then set up my servos and or channels. So obviously a lot of the stuff is servos, but some things aren't servos, like the motor. The ESC is not a servo. So it's just a channel that needs to be set up as well, or landing gear, things like that. So, so we would set up the servos. And then I would also set up them, what we're going to look at called rates or expos, to make it easier or better to fly the plane. And then lastly, I would do a range test. So what's important here also is, for me, this is the order I do them in as well. Early on, as I was learning, I was doing them in different orders than this. And comes back to haunt you later. So this is what I want to look at right off the bat. We'll spend some time looking at this, go through each one, and we will get familiar with these. So regardless of the radio you're using, these still should all be the same. It shouldn't matter which radio you're using, okay? Let's go over to here. So, woohoo. So the key thing is if I go, oops. So in this one, if I do a new model, so now what it did is it automatically put me in that lower menu, the system setup. So whichever radio you're using, it will vary, but I'm not in the function list right now, the one that's only per model. We're in the system level one. And if this is a new one, I don't need to select the model anymore. I just created it. But what I do need to do is tell it the type. So for my radio, there's 4 different types. You can see a plane, a heli, a sailplane, or a multi-rotor. This is going to change everything else that we program. The menus are going to change. The things that are available to us are going to change. So depending on what we pick affects what we're able to program later on. I recommend to folks, if you want to get better at programming your radio, take a plane or make a fake plane with just some servos stuck in poster board and sit in your living room with that thing and just sit there and try all different stuff. Okay. So for today, we're going to just pick an airplane, and it's telling me data is going to be reset, and that's okay because it's a new model. We don't care. The important thing though, is if you had an existing plane and you did that, you would be wiping out everything. So if you went to an existing model and did that, you'd be in trouble. So next, I would want to give it a unique name. So in my model, obviously I can come in here and click and make changes. There's a bit of delay on my end. It's weird doing it like this. So if you're not familiar with doing this type of name change stuff, I'm not going to spend any time doing it right now, but I would change the name so it's unique to that model so I know when I have it up. You guys have any questions? I want you to just stop me and yell, by the way, okay?
I do have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I'm going to be rifling through my radio as we're talking here, that stupid beeping that it makes every time you
roll the roller.
Yeah. How can I shut that off?
Okay, so you guys mind if I deviate from the class schedule and go deal with that?
I'm sorry, I just don't want to interrupt
it's okay.
by beeping on the beeping noise in the background.
That's okay. So I was going to hit it later anyway. So if we go to all the way down to the bottom of the system setup and we go to system settings,
as you can hear,
so we're in that system settings. While we're in here and he's catching up, Sean's catching up, I had to turn my contrast way down and my brightness way down to get this to work. Normally those wouldn't be there. This is where we change battery type. Oops. And where it automatically changes the voltage. And you can see now it flipped it back to 6.4, but I make it 7. Ask me why later. This is where if you don't touch your radio for a little while,
Yep.
it starts yelling at you. So Sean, are you in your system settings?
Yeah, I'm in the system settings, but I'm trying to find that particular screen you're on right there. What is that?
All the way at the bottom of your system menu. So all the way at the bottom of the system setup should be system settings. What model do you have? What generation?
EX8. It's a generation 2.
Yeah.
So it's under system setup?
Settings. System setup first, then system settings.
Did you start your transmitter in a mode where you get to this? Because usually you have to have it powered off and you have to have the switch down when you turn it on in order to get to that setting.
So that's the shortcut when powering up is holding this roller down. The other way to do it, Sean, if you're at the
I'm on it now.
Okay. So if I scroll to the bottom of the function list, we see at the top here, we're on the function list. If I scroll to the bottom of that is system setup. It says, are
Yeah.
you sure? Because it's going to turn the radio off. At the bottom of the system setup is system settings. You go in there and you have all the contrast battery stuff. But at the bottom of that, you hit next. System sounds.
Yeah.
Select roller sounds, inhibit. So active, you click on it and it changes between whether it's active or inactive.
Thank
then
you
you
so
go-
much.
Then you go back, back. Okay.
Okay, that way I don't bother you with the clicking noise. Thank you.
Yeah, you don't bother people at the field either. So anyway, so we made a new model. We changed the type. We set the name. Here's one of the other main kickers. Like I said, picking whether it's a plane, a heli, a sailplane changes the menu structure. So not all options are always available to all model types. So aircraft type now is critical. This is where on a new plane we come in and we say, okay, what kind of wing does it have? Does it have a single servo, or should say a single output channel for both ailerons, or do they have their own servos, or are they flaperons where they can work as ailerons and flaps and so on? So you scroll through here and you pick the one that matches your plane. The normal one where it's one servo, it shows one servo, or it looks like one servo feeding two ailerons. That's fine. It can also be where you have a Y cable coming out of the receiver to feed two servos. The point is, it's one control output from the receiver to control both ailerons. Okay. Any questions there? Well, there's all sorts of stuff here. There's elevons for like flying wings, things like that. So it's very important with a new plane, or you're setting up a new model in your radio, to pick the right type of wing configuration that works for you, and the tail that works for you. Is it a single output channel for the elevator and rudder, or is it a V-tail, or is it dual? Does it have dual elevator? Like Al, you run dual, obviously, right? So you want to pick the right tail type, okay? And I will, just for fun, I'll do that, and I'll do that. Okay. This other stuff, don't worry about it. I'm going to go back. So for right now, again, we're doing just the basic stuff we need. We don't need everything here right now. So I don't need to do this necessarily, but if I scroll down after picking the right wing and tail stuff, and I look at channel assignments, this is where it's going to tell us what our receiver is putting out for the different things that we're going to plug into it. So if you do much with Spectrum, you learn pretty quick. It's always throttle, elevator, rudder. Okay. But if you were watching, I picked 2 servos for my aileron and 2 for my elevator. So we see here that it's saying plug your right aileron in 2 and plug the left aileron into 6, and the right elevator in 3 and the left elevator in 9. So a lot of guys sometimes it's like, okay, where do I plug stuff in? This is where you find where to plug stuff in, just by going into this channel assignment menu. Okay. So at this point, there's 2 ways. So as I said before, we can, hang on a second. So we have a new model. The next thing to do would be to bind the model. Okay. There's 2 ways to bind on these radios. I could turn it off now, and when the plane's ready to be bound, I'd hold the button on top and power it up. Or I'm already in this menu, I can go here and pick bind, and then when the plane is ready, I hit that bind. So let's take a second to talk about binding. If you've ever done any binding, you know that on the receiver, there's usually a port somewhere. Some receivers have a button, but most of our receivers we're using in air have a port where you plug in a special little plug. That's a shorting plug that shorts 2 pins out. And then you power up the plane or power up the receiver. And that puts the receiver into binding mode. So usually tells you that by flashing an LED really fast. So at that point, is when you would go to your radio and do either the power on holding the button or select this from the menu. You need to be a ways away from your receiver at the time, because in binding, the radio goes into high power transmit mode. If you're too close, RF wise, it's shouting too loud. The receiver in the radio gets too much distortion from being shouted at too loud, and it can't bind. So if you've ever had trouble binding because you've got your plane and your radio next to each other on the bench, that's probably why. And if you look up the numbers, they say 6 to 10 feet away. So whenever I'm binding, I get the plane ready, I have the transmitter ready, and then I walk to the other side of the room almost, or not, 10 feet away, and then I hit it, and it should bind successfully. Okay. You need to remember to take the plug out of the receiver before powering it up again, though, because when you power up with the bind plug in the receiver, it wipes out a previous bind and is waiting for a new one. So if you forget and leave that plug in there and power it up again, you're going to have to bind again. Okay.
So Chris, the plug, I think from what you told me before, is nothing special. You don't need, it's just a generic thing you can use on any plane if you're binding.
Yep. And you won't be in this hobby long before you have a pile of bind plugs kicking around.
Yeah.
I have on this radio, you can't see it, but I have a couple bind plugs hanging from the handle on the back. So it's always one of them is always with the radio. So the other thing to point out here is that on a modern radio like these Gen 2 Spectrums, the binding of a receiver to a model in the radio is a unique one-to-one relationship. On my other camera shot here, this old Orange RX from Hobby King, when you bound a radio on here, any model in here, this one has 10 model capacity, any model will control that receiver. So you can accidentally have one plane in your radio, power up another plane, twiddle the sticks, and the surfaces move and the throttle works. And you don't know that in that plane, ailerons are opposite or elevators opposite. And if you don't notice it and go to take off, it'll obviously not fly very well because it's opposite. It's not the way it should be. Trims are wrong, things can be opposite. In a modern radio, like these newer ones we're using, it's a one-to-one relationship. If I have model A plane in my radio and I power up plane B, it's not going to take control of it. It knows there's a unique relationship, and it knows that I haven't powered up the right receiver for the model that's in the plane. Okay. How we doing? Okay. So at that point, now we're at a point where we should have control of our plane. And now we need to set up the servos or other things. Okay. So now I'm in the function list. I'm in that list that's just specific to this plane. And I'm going to go into servo setup first. And on this radio, in this screen here, the first one's travel. And if I pick that, if I pick travel and click on it and then scroll, there's subtrim, reverse, speed. There's some other things too. But most of them will have the first three: travel, subtrim, and reverse. The first one I'm going to go to, and this is important, the first one I'm going to go to is the reversing one. Because more than likely, some of the channels will need reversing. Okay. So I want to make sure those are set correct first before we do anything else. So we'll wiggle the sticks, see which ones are correct and which ones are reversed. And if they're reversed, we'll roll over to that one and we will click the scroller. Click the scroller, the little pickle thing moves up. And now when I move the sticks, they should move the correct way. So it's a good practice to do whatever mnemonic you need in your head to be able to stand behind a plane or stand wherever you want. I stand behind the plane, and based on your stick movement, to look and visually verify that the control surfaces move the correct direction. Okay. So once I'm done reversing everything, the next thing, oops, hang on. It's hard to do when I can't see what I'm doing here. Okay. So the next thing that we would do is subtrim. So again, there's usually an order to when I do them, and there's, for most cases, it's going to be the same order. So the next thing will be subtrim. So are the surfaces where they belong? So back when I did the little servo example of the control arm and all that, the other thing I would be doing back then is with a servo tester, mine has numbers displayed on it. I would have put that servo tester at 0, and in mine that's 1.5 millisecond pulses. I would have centered the servo and done my best to get the control horn mounted on the servo. So you're taking the horn off, putting it back on, and get it mounted so that between the servo arm and the control rod, they're about 90 degrees. There's between them, they're like this. They're not at an angle to each other. There's some cases where you don't want 90, but for all of us, for the most general setup, we want the relationship between the servo arm and the control linkage to be 90 degrees, okay? So if I've already done that and got it as close as I can with my servo tester, it's not gonna be perfect necessarily, it may not be, right? So I've already done all that roughing in mechanically, but now with the radio, I need to dial it in exactly where I want. That's what subtrim is for. We don't want to be using the trims next to the sticks for that. We want to be doing that initially in the subtrim. So in here, it's pretty straightforward. You just roll over to whichever one you want to adjust. You click on it, roll it, and you'll see the surface move real time. And you're going to set those surfaces so they're all neutral. Okay. How we doing there, guys?
It's okay.
Good.
Cool. Okay. So the next thing, oops, would be travel. So this is now where we've got this control surface is all centered, and how you do that's a whole other discussion, but you should be able to tell that they're neutral where they belong. They're lining up with other parts of the wing, or the rudder is lined up with the vertical staff, things like that. Elevator's lined up with its neighboring parts. But now we're going to look at when we pull the sticks all the way one way or all the way another way. Hopefully at this point you have, using your servo tester, you've made the control surfaces move more, a little bit more than what you think you need. So if there's some kind of manual or guidance for the plane you're building, you know, instructions that came with building it, and they say, this control surface needs to move up and down 20 degrees. In the beginning, I would have taken my servo tester, and when I go between 1 millisecond and 2 milliseconds, or 100 and 200, it's what it puts out, I would have given myself a little bit more than that, setting up those holes on the horns and everything. And now in here, I would limit it a little bit. So I'd come in here, and between moving the sticks and adjusting these numbers up and down, I would get it where I want. Now, the box shows both of them, and I'm adjusting both. And if I want to adjust one or the other, I push the stick in that direction. And if you can see that, it only puts a box around one of them. And then I can adjust just that one. So I can push the aileron all the way one way and adjust that deflection of the aileron. Then I can push it the other way and adjust the deflection in that direction separately. And I can end up with two different numbers for how that left aileron deflects. Same thing for elevator, rudder, and all those things. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So at this point, I should have a plane that if I pull back on the elevator, it goes up to my desired deflection, down to my desired deflection. Same thing with the ailerons and rudder. Okay, cool. So the next thing I would want to do at this point is I'd want some expo in there, exponential. Exponential, easily described, or try to describe it easily, is let's say the servo horn goes 0 to 40 degrees. And when I move my stick halfway, I get 20 degrees. And when I move it all the way, I get 40. So if I move it a quarter of the way, I get 10 degrees. 3/4, I get 30 degrees and so on. Okay. But what I want is I want the first bit of stick movement to not move the servo much, not a lot, not as much. So I want to make the center part of the stick movement to be less movement of the control surface. And that's where expos come in. So most of us have probably used expos already. So this is where we would come in and add them, and we would dial up some expo. And again, if you're building a plane that comes with some instructions, they're probably going to tell you how much expo to put. If not, 20, 30, 40, 50 is all in the reasonable range, depending on the plane. You get much more expo than that. The problem is we see that curve flattening out. And what happens then is, as I move this, nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happens, and then suddenly a lot happens. And that can be difficult to fly like that. Granted, there may be some planes and people that works fine for, but generally speaking, that's going to be a little tricky to fly.
I got a question.
Yes.
I never stopped to look, and I'm not sure it would actually do, but on a real flight simulator with different planes, I'm assuming then this is part of the reason why they actually don't all just fly the same.
Could be, yeah.
They might have these types of little specific adjustments made. Obviously, they have different control surface sizes and motors and all that, but I'm wondering, okay, it's just interesting. I hadn't ever looked at this screen or understood what it did.
Yeah, so I don't know real flight, maybe some other guys here do. It may give you the option to set that per plane.
Well, I don't think I would mess around with it, but I was wondering if that's part of what makes it feel and perform a little differently based on the different types, because they do, they're not the same.
I mean, even in real flight in the simulators, I would want some expo in there. So I'm getting that realistic response where I can do little stick movements around the middle of the stick and have the plane, do nice little responses. But if I need a lot, I can yank the stick and get a lot. So anyone else use real flight here and know more about settings?
No, I can't. Other than what Alan is saying, it seems like a lot of planes do fly very similar in that simulator.
Okay.
What I've also noticed, though, is most of the time when I fly my maiden flight, I find that if I haven't done expo, the plane is so twitchy, I just freak out and just cross my fingers to get it back on the ground because my surfaces are so extreme.
Yep. Yeah. And again, if somebody handed me a plane and said, you got to get this thing flying right now, do the bare minimum, these are the things I would have done. I would have, because it doesn't take long just to come in this menu here and throw on 30, 40% expo.
Yep, exactly. 30% is my start point.
Yeah.
And I usually leave it there. So
yeah, it just makes those little stick movements not result in a lot of plane response. We want the aircraft to not be, very twitchy and over responsive. So exponential is where that happens.
Yep, gain control at the lower end of your range. Yep.
Yep. Now I'm not going to show it, but this is called D/R and expo. So DR stands for dual rates. And let's say for some reason I have a plane, and there's lots of them. I want more or less expo, and I want those surfaces to not move as far, depending on what I'm doing. So maybe during takeoff versus flying really fast would be an example. That's where I would come in here and I would assign a switch to this. So if I do that, I'll pick one here. So in Spectrum, you click on it, it's flashing now. If I move any switch, then that's the switch. It goes, oh, you want that switch. So all I do is move this switch, and now I click it again and I've got that switch. So now I've assigned elevator to switch E. And if I go up here, hang on a second. If I go up to the rate, I can turn it way down. So maybe during flying fast, I only want 70%. I want the surfaces to move 70% of what I initially set them to. But later on, when I'm landing and taking off, I flick the switch, and now the surfaces will move 100%. okay? What some of us have been doing lately is using a lot less selection of different rates, picking one that works well as far as how far the services move, and applying enough expo that I can do small stuff, but still get the big stuff when I need it on the stick. Okay. So to recap, assigning a switch here lets us vary. For instance, if I held the elevator full up and I flicked my rate switch, the services would be like 100%, or if I flick the switch to that speed mode, they would drop. So in that 70% mode, they just won't go any farther than, 70% of what I originally set them up for. Okay, any questions there?
Well, initially, I thought that dual rate and expo were mutually exclusive, but you can actually use both.
Yep. Yeah, yeah. So obviously on this setup here, hang on, I didn't do the ailerons. So the other thing too is, we'll throw this out there. They can all be on the same switch. I could assign the same switch to ailerons, to elevator, and to rudder. So they all change with one switch. Okay, or they could be different switches, but I wouldn't want 3 different switches. I wouldn't want to be flipping 3 different switches to change stuff. But I imagine there could be a plane that you want that on. But yes, so if I go back down here, notice I'm in switch position 0 and my rate is 71 and the expo is 0 because I didn't change the expo yet. And when I flick the switch, actually, where is it? Oh, sorry, I didn't do expos on this one yet, did I?
No.
I was in aileron when I did that, yes.
Yep. So
These darn live demonstrations. So now I've got 15% expo and 71% rate. When I flick the switch, it goes to 100 and 0. So they all change with the switch setting. Okay. We'll talk a little more about that later. So.
yep. So
Okay.
initial plane setups, the expo is really important. Dual rates, you'll come on that later as you get used to the plane, but
Yep. So we're just trying to get this plane flying. At this point, now we haven't done anything with throttle yet. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But let's just assume that the throttle response and everything's working fine there. We would want to do a range test. So if you haven't done range tests yet, shame on you. So if you can see that, okay, it says total distance 30 meters. So you need to walk away from the plane 30 meters or 90 feet or 30 paces or more or so, right around that, at least that. And then if I press that button, the bind button that's up on the top here, press that button right there. Let me get it back so you can see it. If I press that button, it says reduced power. So it went from full power transmitting to reduced power. So that's what you're going to do is put it into range test, leave the plane powered up, preferably somebody standing next to it. You're going to walk 30 meters away, 30 paces, 90 feet, and you're going to hold that button and wiggle the sticks. And hopefully the person standing next to your plane goes, yep, it's still moving. Okay. So any questions there?
Hey, Chris,
Yes.
I guess you couldn't hear me last time. On the dual rates, would it be normal to put all of them on a switch?
I've always put all of them on one switch. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't even know you could do it separately.
Yeah. Again, recently, some of us have been getting away from too many switches and too many rates, and trying to, and a number of planes now of mine, I can fly them on just one set of rates with enough expo, but it tends to maybe be a skill thing too, where you get better at only moving the stick a little bit, not being over sticking the plane. So
3D aerobatics, you begin to want to turn your ailerons down, but leave the rudder and the elevator at full.
Okay.
Only during some moves. And like Chris said, I just ignore it and learn how to run the stick without changing any of the rates, so.
Okay.
That's old fashioned radios, you know? We didn't have any option.
No. And we're very fortunate nowadays. The stuff's relatively inexpensive, feature rich, and one radio can do 250 planes. That's a lot of planes with one radio transmitter. Cool. Any other questions relative to this? I believe, I don't know if Al, did I miss anything? I mean, we should have been able to get a plane up and ready and flying reasonably. Was there any other things relative to doing this that I might have missed?
Good presentation, Chris.
Thanks.
Covered the
thank you.
basics.
So I have some other stuff I'll share with you if you want. That's I would also do for all the other stuff. But do we have any questions?
I had a
Actually,
question about the AS3M.
AS3X.
Yeah,
What?
The gyro stuff.
Yeah.
yeah, I put a gyro in one of my planes, and I realized that the only difference is that when I turn on the radio, it takes a longer time for everything to actually match up to the transmitter.
Yep. So there's a lot of new technology out in recent years, obviously, like the AS3X, gyros, and other flight stabilizers or flight controllers. And we saw a number of them last year where it was the Carbon Cubs that had the GPS on them also. And so those systems, even just the AS3X, are going to take a little longer to calibrate and align their gyro and stabilization stuff. So that would be pretty normal.
Okay.
I mean, I have one that's 6 years old now that has AS3X on it when it first came out. And that's, I don't know, 5 seconds or longer than just a normal receiver just coming up right away.
Chris, I have a question. I don't know if it's just my radio, but I have on mine that says phases, like flights of phases. How do you use that stuff?
Yep. So relative to the dual rates, I wasn't going to cover it today other than just to mention it. So thank you, Steve. On Spectrum, it's called flight modes. So I'm guessing your phases are similar to what Spectrum calls flight modes.
Probably.
Or phases of the flight. When I talked about the dual rates, and you can set that to a switch, the more in the sailplane world. So you guys that are on here that do the sailplane stuff, sailplane guys tend to need and make much more use of different modes during the flight time. And the Spectrum has what's called flight modes. So when you go activate flight modes, when I was in that menu there, I told it, hey, use switch E. I could have scrolled down in the list and said, no, use flight modes. Don't use a switch directly, use flight modes. And when I set up flight modes, I would have set flight modes to a switch. And the beauty of flight modes is you can't assign everything to switches sometimes, but you can assign lots of things to flight modes. And so you can have all these different modes, takeoff, thermaling, soaring, landing, and all that stuff. And everything changes based on those flight modes. So I'm guessing, Steve, that's in your Gropner, that's what they're maybe talking about, or it could be something else, but
It sounds like it probably is because
yeah. Yeah.
Yes, that's what
Break the manual out, Steve.
Yes.
Trust me, it's a stick. I've been reading it, and half the stuff goes over my head.
Well, after we talked the other day, Steve, I was thinking it really would, if people take the time to build a little, fake plane that is just servos and fake control surfaces, no propeller, just a little, even a box, with a little cardboard box thing. And you have all those things sitting there, and you can just sit in your living room, at night and play with it and try different things and learn, all the different parts of your radio. The modern radios are powerful. The amount of things they can do, it's ludicrous. So the more we learn about them, the better it is. So
And get in trouble too.
Yes. Yeah. Speaking of which, so if you're flying electrics, you really probably should be using your timer function on your radio so that you're keeping track of your flight time so you land before you've worn out your battery. ESC throttle range. So most generic ESCs, when you first set them up and have bound, you need to teach the ESC the range it's going to see for signal based on your throttle stick. Okay. A lot of guys like to use throttle cut, assign a throttle cut to a switch. Some guys don't like it, but a lot of I use throttle cut on a lot of stuff so that I can, when I'm working on something at the field, if I'm working on the bench, the prop comes off. Okay, first of all, I just did it the other day. I was able to get an ESC motor to freak out and spin the motor up at full speed, and I think that's the second time it's ever happened to me.
Once is enough.
I have 30 stitches from that occurring.
Yeah. So on the bench, prop comes off. At the field, when I'm just doing the general, I'm getting plane ready to fly, I have a throttle cut switch. So just prevents me from accidentally hitting the throttle. Okay. We like to have sounds. We like our radio to talk to us. That's another thing we can program. And again, those system settings, I was going to cover things like the battery voltage and turning off certain sounds, but we already looked at that. So does anybody, so first off, timer, does anybody not use their timer and want to see some of the basics of timer stuff? So
You could just, well, my question is, what's the goal for the battery? You know, like, because different, you know, you test your battery at the end and you want to get to what, I think I made this note before, and I feel like the timer certainly helpful, but I was able to adjust it and add a little bit more time and not overdo it.
Yep.
I think it was what, to get it down to like 3 point, I haven't memorized those.
3.7 roughly.
For your battery when you test it later.
Yep. So you land and unplug, you know, so a minute, you land, and then by the time you grab the plane and go over to the bench and unplug it and you put the checker on, it's been a minute, 30 seconds, whatever, you know, you should see 3.7, 3.8. You know, if you're stopping at 3.9 or 3.8, that's fine. You could have flown a little longer, but you're being nice to your battery. So you don't want to be below, let's say 3.7 or 3.6, because that means you are much lower and the battery has recovered a little bit in 30 seconds to a minute. So
Just a word about that. I have one twin that I fly quite a bit off the water, and I used to rely on my guess of how long I was up.
yeah.
But I realized that the problem was that when the batteries ran down, one motor quit before the other.
Oh,
And because it's electric, you don't hear the noise difference.
yeah.
And what it immediately was, it was spin each time. And so I figured that out, that timers are important, especially on multi-engines.
Yes. And so we're talking about programming radios, but there's other things that can be programmed, and one of them is the ESC. So depending on your ESC and depending on how it can be programmed, the ones that program with the sticks can be a little tricky because it's patting your head, rubbing your stomach and stuff all at the same time. But if there's software or a little programming card, one of the things you can do is tell it, oh, well, typically an ESC out of the box is going to start to back off the motor and not let you run it as hard as the battery voltage gets low. So it's trying to save the battery at the expense of the plane sometimes. So if you're having to do a go around and the ESC is programmed to save the battery, it's going to start backing off the throttle and you may not be able to make it back home to the field. So a lot of my planes, I either turn that way down or I turn it off, because I'd rather hurt the battery a little bit and safely land the plane than to have it stop. So I wonder if maybe on that particular setup you have, if the ESCs can be adjusted a little bit so that they don't start cutting off on you and let you land. Okay.
Yeah, crashing planes, because it's set to ESC is set to hard shut off instead of the soft shut off, or turned off altogether.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're hovering at 12 feet and hard cutoff happens, You're done.
There's no recovery from that, is there?
No, and Mark actually, immediately he's like, it sounded like a hard cutoff, and because I checked the battery voltage, and I'm
Oh.
like, the battery seemed okay because it had recovered,
Yep.
and it was just the ESC just said, you hit that voltage, you're done. So setting it to soft voltage can save a plane, or even to
Yep.
turn it right off altogether.
If you,
Again, that's ESC programming that's
Yeah.
part of today, but
yeah, well, it sort of is.
it is. It's related. Yeah.
So we should all know too that when we put a battery in a plane that's fully charged and say it's 4.2 volts per cell, and we throttle up to go down the runway and take off, if we looked at the voltage, or if you use an ESC that logs it, the voltage drops dramatically. It is not linear and proportional to the flight time. It's proportional to your throttle. And you'll drop down to, you can drop down to 3.8, 3.9, 3.7 right during takeoff, because the battery is spongy, if you will, on the voltage it provides based on the current leaving it. So if an ESC is set to be either hard cutoff or soft cutoff, it may be doing it right from the beginning if the battery is not able to support the full current during takeoff. So one other thing about ESC, so most ESCs, I'll give you two that don't do this, but most ESCs, you should be teaching it the range it's going to see for stick. And the way you do this is, most ESCs nowadays do this. You put the stick at full, you power up the plane, and the ESC, say it normally goes beep, and then 3 beeps for 3S, and then an arming sound. It'll do 3 beeps and then 1 beep. And that's, if you look at the manual, that's saying, oh, we see that the throttle's full, and you either want to set the throttle range or go into programming menu. So the manual for your ESC will tell you that. And when you hear that unique beep, you immediately bring it to 0. It does some more beeps and arms. And what you just taught it was, this is full throttle, this is 0 throttle. And what it does is go, okay, I'll work just within that just a tiny bit. So it takes the low end and uses just a little more than that to start spinning, takes the top end and uses just a little less than that for full throttle. Okay.
On a gas-powered airplane, if you put a volt watch on it, you'll notice that when you were talking about how much power draw you have basically with a power system, it's also true for the radio itself driving the servos.
Yes.
If you look at what happens is, when you start moving your servos a lot, your drain on the system is quite high.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So one good test on a new plane is to take both sticks and do the movement that makes all servos move at the same time. You wouldn't do that in flight, but if it survives that test on the bench, then it should be okay in flight.
Yeah.
Well, Al does that in his flying, but
on that line,
Snaps.
one of the I started flying radio control probably with a digital radio, probably about 1972, and the fatal flaw that killed most airplanes basically was the receiver battery dying in flight. And I put I bought a small voltmeter basically with a load to test my batteries, and knock on wood, I've never lost another airplane from loss of receiver battery. I think it's a good idea to basically routinely check your power to your receiver from your receiver batteries, if they're independent of your ESC system, every time you fly.
Yep. So let's see, on your timer setting, I have my timer set that when the stick is above a certain percentage, the timer runs. And when the stick is below that, the timer stops. Because if I'm gliding for a little while, I don't want the timer running. Okay.
Okay.
So most radios, you have an option where the first time it goes up above a certain level, it just keeps ticking down the timer, no matter what you do. But I use the one where it only runs on above, and when I'm gliding around, it stops. Okay. Let's see. Sounds. we don't need to go through it right now, but there in the spectrum, you go to sounds, switch change report, and you can pick from a whole bunch of sounds that are in there. And when you flick the switches, she talks to you. So my throttle cuts talk to me, throttle cut on, throttle cut off, that kind of stuff. It's very helpful for a plane I haven't flown in a long time. So I turn the radio on with the plane off and I flick all the switches to find out which ones do what, because it talks to me.
Chris, can you walk through on how to assign, like on the plane that I have, I think when I first came out to the field, that first you set it up, and then I built one with my son, and we built two actually. And in one case, I managed somehow to get it to assign it to where I wanted, so it was the same. And my thought is I want to have all of them be the same so that I'm consistent. And now I was trying to figure that out, and I struggled with getting it set up.
What is it you want it to do?
I've been sort of training myself to use H, that top, that top right one on the bottom, that long switch, and use that as a throttle cut so that if I'm out,
okay,
we've been pretty good about it landing, and I can turn that off if my son goes to pick up the plane or whatever, and that kind of thing.
So if I press my roller wheel to go into the first menu function list,
yeah,
and if I go down to throttle cut and I select that,
and
on a new plane, it's going to be inhibited. It's not doing anything.
Right.
And if I click it once, now it's flashing. I would flick whatever switch I want to use for throttle cut. And it's going to go, oh, you want to use that switch.
Oh, okay. Well, that's pretty easy.
But now, once I flick that switch, I have to press the roller again to say, yep, that's the one I want. And when I do that, I get this little menu. And that little pickle, we watched that little pickle down there. Hang on, let me get that thing off there. So that little pickle moves back and forth to go, okay, that's the off setting, 0 being off, 1 being on. Okay, so off, it's not doing anything, but on, it would be throttle cutting. And the I don't know why so here's one I'm gonna give you a watch out for. It says it's taking it to minus 130%. So they're kind of like, we're gonna make sure this thing's off, because minus 130 is as far down as it can go. Okay. But I've taught all my ESCs that to go from minus 100 to plus 100. So I make it go to minus 100 to be off.
Okay.
I'll tell you this. It's at work with a guy flying a multi-rotor at work this past week. He found out the wrong way that when he hits throttle cut, and it's an old multi-rotor, we don't know how the manual for the flight controller. When you hit throttle cut, it does that. It goes to really negative. The multi-rotor takes off. So just to say that, I'll just throw the caveat out there that doing something different than normal, you want to make sure you know that thing that you control, in this case, the ESC, that, if you're going to force it to minus 130, which is not something that it normally would see, or you saw that it doesn't do something strange.
Yeah, mine app just went to negative 100.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
And then what I need to do is compare with the ones that I'm used to, because now I'm sitting here trying to remember which way is off and on. Is it up or down, and making sure that I make them all the same, and I can just switch them.
So now while we're in the function list, if I go to custom voice setup and I add a new sound event and I add a switch change report, and then I pick which switch I want, and I flick that same switch, and then I select it, and then I go to position 0 and I say, I'm not going to take the time to find it in the menu, but I'll just do this. Just so I pick something. It's in there. Throttle cut. Her talking to you and saying throttle cut's in there.
Stunt 1. Stunt 2.
I don't know if you can hear that.
Yeah, no, I heard it. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So Chris, I had a question.
Yeah.
Say I wanted the switch to be opposite. I would go to that position, and instead of minus 130, I just go to plus 130 and reverse the positions for the two different positions.
You're talking about the throttle cut?
Yep.
Yep.
The throttle cut, it doesn't toggle the way I want it to, and I wanted to switch that around. Is it just a matter of using the position to
I believe so.
switch those numbers
So
depending
you're
on
saying,
whether it's 0 or 1?
so in this case, you're saying when it's normally on and cutting the throttle, you don't want it to do that.
Well, just to say if the switch goes a different way than I expected or wanted.
Yeah. I believe in the Spectrum, this unique thing called throttle cut. What it's doing is when it's off and into
Stunt
0,
1.
it's hands off and it's not doing anything to the throttle. And when it's on, it applies the number you've picked. So I don't think you can reverse it because it's
Yeah.
unique. It's unique in the fact that we've picked it from the menu. We haven't created it from scratch.
Yep, it's not a servo type of thing to switch. Yeah. Okay.
Well, yeah, because it's a unique menu item. To do what you're asking, that would just be a mix, probably. And you can still apply the voice to it that says throttle cut on, throttle cut off.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, you get to do the switch as well. Pick your switch too. So.
Yeah. But I think you can accomplish what you want using a mix. Some other things to tell you guys. For the Spectrum guys, and probably for all the other radios out there, Spectrum radios, you can, if you're buying a Horizon plane or plane that's from the same people as Spectrum, they have all the models pre-built on the Horizon site. So using that SD card, I could, like did it last summer with some of those V900s or the EFX racers. You can just go get the model, put it on SD card, put it in the radio, and bring it up, and so you get a good starting point from someone else. So you don't have to necessarily always create your own models. In the model utility, I make use of this. So in the model utilities, you can sort your models. So I sort mine. Normally they're by the number when you create them. Every model gets a number in there. That's how I keep track of them. But you can sort them by name if you want. So my model list. So the shortcut to get to your models when you're at the field is hold clear, press back. So you don't have to use the thumb wheel to get there. So all my models are in here alphabetically, A, B, except for 9 quad. I got to move them. But it's in there alphabetical. It makes it easier to find my planes. So I'll tell you some other things. When we trim a plane and you hit this click, 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 click to trim, this one's moving in steps of 2. That's adjustable. There's a setting in your radio, if you're using these kind of radios, where that could be 5s or 1s, okay? There's also a setting where, let's say we're using those flight modes, right? And we're flipping the different modes on the plane, depending on where we're doing takeoff, flying around, landing, sailing and stuff. We may want those trims to be the same no matter what, or we want the trims to move along with the different modes we're in. So you don't need to worry about how to learn that or anything. Just know that, oh, that's a possibility. If there's different trim settings I need to have depending on the mode the plane's in, my switches in, that can happen too. Okay. Wireless trainer we talked about. And you've probably seen at the field when we're doing training. So there's menus for that in there to set that up. Mixing is another one that you should play around with. A mix is where you send one input to some other output. So I was trying to think of examples of this, Al. Like some guys mix. Well, I do lots of mixes for other reasons, but you may mix rudder into aileron when you're doing knife edge, because a plane, when you put on knife edge, tends to want to flop back over when you give it rudder. So you may mix a little in there so that it does that when you're doing knife edge. So there's lots of other reasons for doing mixes. A
I just learned with one of my more recent planes, when you add flaps, it likes to add a little elevator up to compensate that.
Yep. Or you would mix rudder to the nose wheel for steering. And the reason for that is if you Y it in, it's going to move as much as you adjust the rudder. And when you trim the rudder, it's going to trim the nose wheel. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
But you may say, well, I want the wheel to just steer a little bit based on the rudder. I want the rudder to move a lot and the wheel to steer a little. Well, in the mix, you adjust how much you want to send over there. So you only send a little bit over and the nose wheel only moves a little bit. Okay.
Question, Chris. So that would be on all the time? The
Mixes have a switch input on this radio.
Means leave.
So you would have to have each servo on a separate
What's that?
cord, right? On a separate channel?
REC?
You don't want to
Depends.
record it, do
No.
you?
No.
Hang on a
That's
second.
it.
How do you?
Ken. I muted Ken. So if I'm sending, what were we saying? We were saying if I send rudder to aileron or something, I'll just pick anything, doesn't matter. So down here on my radio, I can have it where it only does it based on a switch setting or a flight mode.
So you'd still have that, you'd have to have each servo on a different channel?
Well, you can, like, for instance, I'm sending it to right aileron here as an example. It's gonna apply to both. Oh, that's great. You'd have to give me a more specific application than we could talk about, but yes, you got to be sending it. You're going to be sending it to a channel or, whoops.
So I couldn't put it on a Y with the rudder.
No, you need two different servos.
Oh, yeah. Yes, a separate channel. Yes,
separate channels, separate servos to do mixing.
But what I was going to say is you're sending it like here. It can be sent out to the aux channel. It's not, doesn't have to necessarily be a channel that's already dedicated to something.
Yeah.
Right.
But a separate signal. Okay.
Yeah, but it does need to go to one of the channel that is listed in the channel assignments. And things like these things that are just left as aux2 and aux3. So let me back up. Right there, LAL, left aileron, that was aux1. But if you remember when I set this model up, I chose 2 servos, so it stole aux1 for left aileron. But it hasn't stolen aux2 yet or aux3. Okay. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm going to change my receiver because that makes stuff a lot easier, because I always have issues and I try to change the servo horns.
Yeah. So let's be clear too. Once you've taken an output of a receiver, put a Y cable on it and plug 2 servos into it, you cannot do anything separate with those. They are both receiving the same signal. You're not talking to them. You cannot talk to them separately. In this kind of setup that we've been talking about last week and this week, where we're plugging in that classic 3-pin connector, that's PWM signals. There are other kind of servos out there that you can use that receive a serial communication, and you have to tell each servo a unique name, and they're all talking off of one wire, and that's a whole other thing. So, but where they each get a dedicated output, yeah, they need a dedicated output. What was the thing you said, Al? You were doing mixing for what? What was the mix?
With flaps, you would mix to the elevator, which would always be there because you put your flaps down. You can tell it, I'm doing half flaps. It would say give it a 3% elevator increase. Full flaps gives me a 6% elevator increase.
Yeah.
So
one thing I'll tell you guys here then, as long as we're talking about flaps, because a lot of things have flaps, on my function list, the list unique to the plane, not the system one, there's nothing in here for flaps. Okay. But because back here, I didn't tell it had flaps. Okay, but now I will. And if we go back to the function list again and scroll down, now flaps showed up. And that makes sense because I only told it it had ailerons. I didn't tell it it had flaps. So it got rid of the flap system menu. But now that I have flaps, I can go in here and I can say, yeah, I have flaps and I want them on this switch right here, switch F. I click it to select it. And now I can have flaps, 3 different positions of flaps. And
look how smart it is. It knows it wants an elevator.
So when I give it 10% flaps, it might need a little bit of well, I'm looking at my screen, not the radio itself. No, hang on. Yeah, I might want to give it a little bit of elevator. And when I give it a lot of flaps, I give it even more elevator. Okay. There you go. Oh, what's really cool about flaps in here, and then when I flick the switch, I can tell it to take.
Oh, wow. Come down slow.
So you want the flaps to go. And one main reason I would want my flaps to move slow is it does a lot of response to flap change. And if it's instant, the plane's going to, instantly do this strange thing in the air that I don't want it to do.
Or you have to be really ready for it like I am.
Well, or if I accidentally hit it when I'm going fast, it's
not
gonna go well.
So there, I learned my new thing for the day right there.
Okay.
So
But you would have had to tell it back in the system setup that it has that. Okay. Anyone else? Is there anything else that anyone's thought of that they want to know about radios?
Yeah, I have a question on the mixing, Chris.
Yeah, I have a question.
Your rule of
Go, Rick.
Yeah, your rule of thumb on the for just generally flying around to beginners, are you teaching to to add some rudder on your turns for coordinated turns, and do you ever mix that in just so you can just basically bank the aircraft left and right, and then you've got that automatic mix in? I'm wondering if you program the transmitter to do that, and I'm thinking you probably wouldn't want that when you're landing. You probably want complete independence with your rudder and aileron, but your thoughts on that, I'd be curious.
I'm going to defer to Al first.
Well, thanks.
Well, you've been teaching longer than I have. So.
Well, yeah. I mean, basically, when the ASX systems came out and gyros came out, I told my students to turn them right off. Basically, when it comes down to learning how to fly, I'm like, get back to the basics and keep the basics. If you're trying to have a radio help you make a turn, then I think you're doing it wrong. Basically, as you're flying your plane, if a turn makes the plane go down, I instruct my students, give it a little elevator and keep the plane level. Fly the plane. Don't try to let the radio do that for you. My take.
I would agree too. We had those Cubs, those carbon Cubs coming, the new ones last year with some different guys, and the ones that had the GPS in them were really just getting in the way of teaching them how to fly their plane.
Well, that's what we found. We found the ASX system, as you start to turn the plane into a nice banked turn, the ASX will try to level the plane out. And I'm like, you're not getting the natural feel of how a plane would bank into a turn and maintain the bank. The ASX was just giving us all kinds of false moves that weren't natural. So I basically landed the plane. I'm like, okay, where is this switch? And turned it off. Then I took my student up again and said, okay, here, now we're going to make normal banked turns.
Yeah. So you're talking about safe select. The safe mode.
Select,
safe mode select. Well, the ASX also has a gyro where you're in a turn. You've then neutraled your sticks for that immediate for that half that turn. You're actually neutral in 6. The neutral of the sticks, the gyro on the plane said, well, then I need to be level. So I'm halfway into a bank. I neutral the sticks to complete the turn normally, and the ASX would level the plane out, and I'd be, fighting the actual plane to make the turn.
As I have a comment. As a new owner of one of these Cubs, I'm glad I I sort of got lucky and didn't get the built-in geofencing stuff. But I think why that becomes useful is if someone isn't, and I'm glad that I've connected with you folks, if you don't have any sort of group of people to teach you and mentor you, and you're just doing it on your own, the idea of, oh, I'm not going to crash my 200, 300, whatever dollar investment is certainly enticing. And then I would think it's going to encourage people to rely on the technology more, which is, now that I haven't done it and feel like I'm already past that, it is easier to but you have to have some safety net. And in this case, it's people to coach you versus figuring it out on your own.
Yeah. I mean, the ASX also had what they call the panic button, which I totally agree with. And that is the plane is going into a dive. It's almost upside down. The new flyer's panicking and doesn't know how to get it out of that thing. They have, of course, now the panic switch, which says, fine, put the plane in a level flight doing 50 feet off the ground as a normal default. I love that idea. If somebody's out, like you say, they're learning, they haven't got an instructor, they get in wicked trouble, at least their plane's not going to crash directly immediately when they push the button. Instead, it's going to fly away and they'll never see it again. But
well, and I don't think when I was very new to flying that I'm still not good enough to have the wherewithal to say to myself, I'm in trouble and I need to hit this switch and to get to it before the plane hits the ground. So
the panic freezes you. Yes.
But we've been in the club flying hobby long enough though to see that anybody who wants to learn to fly, no matter how they do it, is going to learn to fly if they want to learn to fly. So whether they do scratch building or they buy the full-on geofence type stuff, if they're committed to it, they're going to learn. And so it's just different avenues to get up to speed, I think.
But I have a question. I'm sorry. I have a question, Chris.
One more caveat is the systems may be getting a lot better as far as the ability to do the gyro stuff. Yeah, I'm talking a plane now that probably came out 4 or 5 years ago at least. So I'm sure by now things have probably gotten a lot better. But Chris has been doing more training this last year or two. So
Steve, 1 second. So to finish this up, to clarify the difference between a stabilization system where it has gyro, but all it does is if you don't command something like a roll or a pitch and the wind or whatever causes it, it counters that only. So like Al was saying, he rolled into a turn, the plane's banked, and then he put the stick neutral, which a real plane would just stay in the bank, and it goes back. That's beyond stabilization, and that's now taking control of the plane. And then there's all levels above that. So stabilization is great, making the plane just fly a little smoother when it's a little windy or whatever, and just helping you keep it, from being erratic. Those are fine, obviously. So Steve, you have a question?
I had a little bit different question on the mixing. Now mine, the one I'm working on, has 2 engines. Can that be used to adjust the thrust so they're even through the speed controllers?
Yes. Yep. So
but
you
have to have 2 channels on each speed controller?
Yep. So if I mixed my, well, I mean, obviously I could show you on there, but if I went in there and I picked throttle and sent throttle to aux 3, for instance, and then I plugged the second motor into aux 3, I would pick, well, send, more or less of throttle to aux 3.
And you can do throttle curves as well. I know Gary with his twin, he went through like, I don't know, a whole day of just getting the actual trim and throttle curves to match up. He was like, well, for the first third of the throttle, both engines are good. And then in mid-range throttle, one would decide to be a little higher than the other. And so what Chris is doing now, he adjusts the curve for each engine so that they would stay matched throughout the whole throttle range for both of his engines.
So for, like Sean, right? Is he still on here or is he gone? I think we lost him. For the guys that run the gassers, they don't, they don't have a linear response to the stick. So before I changed this, it was a straight line. It would, you know, if you go half, the servos moved half. So a throttle curve, the engine, the gasser engine doesn't respond linearly. You get much more throttle early on. So by tuning this curve, you make the engine now respond more what you would expect it to where the stick is. Okay. So it's not the same as Expo. Expo is both sides being adjusted. This is the whole thing. Yeah.
Chris, I have a question.
Yes, Don.
Dave was helping me set up my SIG Senior. We put in a new receiver, a new ESC, a new flight control in it. And after we bound it, we turned on the throttle and the motor started making loud knocking noises. Have you ever experienced anything like that at all?
And this is electric plane?
Yeah.
So there'd be number of issues. Was there a time that it ever worked correctly, or this is from the beginning?
No, these were all new components. We put in a new ESC. It never been flown with the new flight controller, new receiver, and a new ESC.
Okay. And does it only do it at when you first bring up the throttle and the throttle is fairly low, or would it do it no matter where you put the throttle stick?
I think it did it at the higher speeds. I just bought a new motor, but I wondered if you had ever seen anything like this happen before.
Yep. So I've seen a number of things. Some ESC motor combinations will have some trouble starting, and when you first move the stick slowly and you get right to where the ESC tries to start running the motor will stutter, and not quite spin right. And on some of those, I have ones that are little indoor planes that'll do that, and I got to go like woo, 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 bump them a little bit, and then they fly fine. The other times I've seen it is usually when either the ESC is damaged or something else is going on, maybe a poor solder connection or something on one of the bullets that link the three together, the three wires between the ESC and the motor. So it's either a combination of something's broken or it's just incompatibility between the ESC and the motor. There also can be, depending on what you're using, again, for most of our discussions, we're down the middle where things usually just work. But I have some stuff that I have to adjust the ESC settings, some of the more technical settings of the ESC to make it work best with the motor. But that's more for performance, not just to get it to spin correctly.
Yeah.
So
I've actually, though, Chris, had a situation where the motor didn't really, I mean, it buzzed and it actually made noise during flight. And it's what Chris was talking about. It's called ESC timing.
Yep.
So the manufacturer sets a default for LiPo batteries with a particular motor being, a brushless motor, but there is settings for timing changes for those setups between the ESC and the motors. And most of the time, you never have to touch them. Once in a while, it is required to play around with that a little bit.
So a quick test. Yeah, a quick test for Don, you and Dave, is try another ESC on that motor and try another motor on that ESC.
Yeah, we bought a new motor, but haven't had a chance to try it yet.
Okay. Yep. So what I was talking about on the timing, without getting real technical, you can always ask me later how all this stuff works, but the ESC is turning the battery voltage on and off really, really fast to the motor. And that's when I say really fast, 10,000 times, 12,000, 15,000 times a second. And that's just for that one little part of the rotation where it's energizing two of those wires. So it energizes two of the three wires with that really high frequency, and then it switches to the other two for really high frequency. And then, so it's that timing of the high frequency pulses going to it.
Yeah.
If for whatever reason you've got an ESC and a motor that just aren't meant for each other. So Yeah.
I mean, how much noise is it actually making, Don? I mean,
Well, it's really a loud knocking noise while it running. It almost sounds like it's trying to stop and start or something, you know,
it shouldn't be that bad with timing. I mean,
Is it
when I burned
turning?
out a bearing, I had motors sound like that.
Is it turning at all?
Oh yeah, the motor's running and all of a sudden you get these loud knocking noises. So I just
Okay.
did the motor, but I haven't tried it out yet.
Here's what I need you to do. Get like what I use for my work. Get high power reading glasses or some kind of loop or microscope or magnifying glass and look inside the motor for any screws or anything that may have accidentally dropped in there, because your brushless CSCs are full of magnets and they're very powerful magnets. Anything steel gets close to it, gets sucked in there. So it sounds like maybe there might be a loose piece of something rattling around inside the motor.
That's a good idea. I actually had a motor throw one of its magnets.
Yep,
and
that
same
too.
thing.
So Don, is this motor the kind where the outside of the motor turns or the inside turns? You know what I mean? Where some of these motors, it's the outside that spins and stuff. So if it's an outrunner, all the magnets are glued inside that can that spins around that you see spinning. So again, get your magnifying glass out and look in there and make sure all those magnets are where they belong.
Okay. Thank you.
I've killed a few motors that way with the magnets coming off.
Yeah, I had the same issue with the Corsair I had, and me and Mark worked on. We ended up changing out the speed controller, and it was fine.
Here's something. So you get you're building something new, and you decide to power up the ESC so that you can get the BEC to power your receiver so you can test some servos. But you've got the 3 wires for the motor just sitting loose on the bench. If they touch each other at all, you're likely to damage the outputs of your ESC. So it's actually okay to power up an ESC with the 3 wires for the motor disconnected, but don't let them touch each other electrically.
All right.
Okay. Anything else?
Can you, I'm either I just am being thick-headed, which is often possible, or my DX8E doesn't have, I just am missing where the sound control, like the, when it was sort of the second half of that throttle cut conversation.
Yeah.
Can you show me on your?
So it's a DX8, what?
8 with the letter E.
It may not have much voice capability.
I don't know that it does. I don't get the sense that I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I found the throttle cut and I checked all my things and made sure that I've assigned them all.
Yeah.
So I just didn't know if there was something, and I'm starting to draw the conclusion that it just doesn't do it, which is fine. I just want to make sure I wasn't losing it.
Yep. No, it's you have the E for, save some money. So that's one of the features they don't give you, basically.
Got it.
I'm pretty sure. So I'll double check while we're talking. I'm going to look it up right now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it doesn't, because I think originally I was going to go for like a DX8, and I think that was one of the, or the DX9, and I think that was one of the upgrades to it, the voice prompts. So that would be my guess, is it doesn't have it.
Yeah.
The E version.
Okay.
It's not the end of the world. I'm still, I feel like it's plenty for the very first time to get me started, but I didn't know if I was just missing some system, one of the options.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks so much. I'm going to head out.
Okay.
And good seeing everybody.
Yes. That was a great class. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other?
Thank you.
All
I
good?
just wanted to add one thing.
Hey, thank you, Chris.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Thanks, Chris.
Awesome. Take care, guys.
Thank
you guys.
all.
See you.
Take care.
Yeah.